Well, good morning. How's everyone doing today? Good, good. I mean, we should be good. You guys have sugar in you now, right? It's a good day, yeah. Hey, you guys know that when we begin a time of looking at God's Word and the sermon, before we get into that, we want to remind ourselves of that this is not about just anyone in particular. This is about all of us coming together, giving each of us our own part to play in making God glorified and making God famous this morning. Because we're a church for those who have given up on church, and that means that we all are needed for this. So we want to give a round of applause, especially this morning, to the setup and teardown team. Because, I mean, for 10 years, guys, they have been making this all happen around us. That's a lot of work, and we know that this is going to start coming to an end as we're going to move to a building. So let's give them our appreciation this morning for all that, right? So about a year and a half ago, I was in Israel. I was in this historical trip, vacation kind of thing. It was great. I mean, I'll tell you, I'm not one of those guys who vacations and wants to go to the beach and just lay out all day. Like, that's my wife's thing, but I get rather bored after like 10 minutes out there. I'm more of one of those, I would rather go hike in a place I've never been, discover new sights and a bit of history, and feel like I'm part of it. Like, I'm a nerd like that. So this trip to Israel was long in the planning, and it was like a dream come true to be able to walk around and see the places where we read in the scriptures of the Bible, see these places with my own eyes. And on one of the days, we stopped at a place called the Sea of Galilee, which is more like a lake. It's this circular body of water. It's actually smaller than Lake Wapapello. And we stopped there, and we were going on a boat tour there because this was a spot that Jesus did a lot of his ministry, that in his earthly ministry, before he went to Jerusalem to be killed, he kind of did laps around the Sea of Galilee. And so we wanted to go and experience this. And so we get out there on this wooden boat, and we get out into the middle of the water, and it was so cool to be able to look around and be able to think, well, that's where he fed the 5,000. And that's where, he turned water into wine. And that's where, he healed an entire village. And it was this really special, powerful moment. You were looking around, you're like, this is what Jesus saw. This is where Jesus did his work. And it was this incredibly powerful experience. And all of us in our group are sitting there thinking, we need to do something to rejoice, to worship in this moment, something to kind of celebrate in this moment, all that God did in Jesus around this area. And our captain, I think, sensed this because he stops the boat in the middle, turns on the speakers, and then he's like, hey guys, it's time to dance. That's right. That's his response. And so I'll tell you, my deep-seated Baptist roots I grew up in immediately did not like the idea of dancing, okay? And so immediately, he turns on the music, and all of us split on one side or another, boys on one side, girls on another, and we're just like awkward middle school dance, just staring at each other. Like, none of us wants to do this. And I'll be honest, all I was thinking at that moment was, I can't dance with another female. If my wife finds out, she'll cut me. You guys think that's a joke, but she's right there nodding her head yes. And so I think we're all kind of thinking that to some degree. So we're all just awkwardly, separate from each other. Like, I wasn't even brave enough to do my favorite and only dance move, the finger wiggle. Like, I'm just sitting there like, this is not a place I want to be at all. And the captain was really good. The captain immediately sprang from his platform, called us all to circle up. We linked arms, and he started to teach us this Middle Eastern dance that's all coordinated. And we're all like kicking and spinning in a circle, and we're shouting out phrases in Hebrew or Aramaic that I have no idea what they mean. And it was a great time once we got going, and we got the routine going, and it was a perfect way to actually celebrate what God had done in this place of just being able to dance and rejoice of, look what God has done. We cannot help but celebrate. And to remember that moment, I've got in my car, my little rearview mirror, a little piece of stone from the Sea of Galilee that's hanging up, so I can always think back and remember I can always rejoice because it was a perfect day, a perfect experience, just a perfect day. But I should probably tell you, to no surprise to anyone here, that it is not always a perfect day out on the Sea of Galilee. So let me give you some geography lessons here, okay? The Sea of Galilee is prone to some very violent, out of nowhere storms that can happen in an instant. And the reason being is the geography of the land. So you have the Mediterranean Sea off to the west, and the wind will blow off the Mediterranean Sea. It will travel a few miles inland, and then it will fall off of this cliff and fall into this bowl known as the Sea of Galilee. And the Sea of Galilee is surrounded on all sides by hills and cliffs. So when the wall or the wind comes off of one hill, falls into the bowl, it can't go back over on the other side of the hill. So it just starts to spin like a toilet bowl. And it starts these storms out of nowhere that can happen in an instant. In fact, some of the days when we were staying in a hotel around there, it was storming like every night. This was a very common occurrence. In fact, if you read the scriptures, they're very common in telling these storms that suddenly appear up, especially if you read texts like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All of them have at least one, if not multiple stories about Jesus versus a literal storm. And since our theme this summer is talking about the storms in life, I think we should probably talk about how Jesus responded to a literal storm, a literal crisis that was thrown upon him. And then probably the most famous story of Jesus versus storms is in Matthew chapter 14, where we're going to be at this morning. So if you have a Bible and you like to read along, feel free to go ahead and turn there. But let me give you some of the context of what's going on. So Matthew chapter 14, the part where we're going to be jumping in is in the evening. But you have to understand what happened in the morning. You see, that morning, Jesus gets the worst news, where his cousin, John the Baptist, has just been executed. And he doesn't have time or the opportunity to really process this tragedy because he's got 5,000 other people around him who are constantly saying, hey, we need this from you, Jesus, and Jesus, we would like you to do this. So he doesn't get time to really process his feelings, process what has just happened as he's heard this tragic news. And so he's got to feed these people, and we know the story. It's the famous story where Jesus takes a few fish sandwiches, the fish fillet sandwiches, and he kind of feeds 5,000, right? And immediately right after that happens, the crowd get in an uproar. They're like, man, this guy is the perfect meal ticket. We should make him our king. We should go and storm the Roman emperor, the gates, get rid of the tyrants, and we should establish our own kingdom. And the people are getting excited because this is something they have longed for. They have longed for a king like Jesus. But they've had this history of other messiahs, other people around the time of Jesus who were standing up and saying, hey, I'm this long-awaited promised king. And it always lead in this rebellion against Rome that always fails because you can't beat Rome in a military battle. And Jesus knows what they're asking of him, what they're begging of him is basically, hey, will you lead us into battle? And Jesus doesn't want this. So he immediately starts to dismiss the crowd. He's like, we got to get rid of this. We got to stop this. You guys need to go home. If you read the story, he does this odd thing where instead of Jesus slipping away, he sends his disciples away so he can dismiss the crowd, which I always found as odd. I would think, and it would make more sense for Jesus to get away and have his disciples send off the crowd because they're all after him. But Jesus does it the other way around, and I think it's because he knew what was going to happen next in our story, and he wanted the disciples to wait on him rather than him waiting on them. And so we get in this moment in chapter 14 where we can finally read in verse 23. It says, and after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. So finally, Jesus gets to be alone. He gets time to kind of process the tragic news he has just heard. His world has just been shaken by hearing the news that his cousin is dead. And he gets time to process it, but Jesus is doing more than just doing some self-care here. He knows what's coming for the disciples. And he's intentionally taken a step back away from them temporarily to see how they're going to handle the current situation. Because they have just watched Jesus provide the great need that was for the people. But that need was more of an inconvenience. Because the real test is coming for the disciples and what happens next. Because as night begins to come and darkness starts to go over the lake and they're out there in the boat, a storm appears. And the storm described in Matthew's gospel, the word that Matthew uses to describe this storm is the same word that we would use to say the word torture or terrorize. He's saying the storm is that violent. And these fishermen, they've experienced these storms before. They've seen these kind of storms pop up and just shred boats. They've seen people drown from this. And in that day, that was the most terrifying thing that could happen to someone, is to drown. And for two reasons. One, if you were a Gentile, the mindset was that if you drowned, you weren't allowed to have a proper burial. And if you weren't able to have a proper burial, then you weren't able to get into their view of paradise, to be able to pay your way in. That was the Gentile mindset. Now, the Jews didn't share that mindset, thinking, okay, if you drown, you're not going to be in paradise. But they did have the mindset and thinking that the sea was the place where the demons lived. And we typically think it's like a fiery furnace like hell, but in the Jewish mindset, no, they thought it was the bottom of the sea. So here this storm comes up that is so terrifying, so extreme that there's no way to describe it other than that it's like a terrorist attack. That's how Matthew's describing this moment. And it's so deadly. They're panicking. They're thinking, if we die out here, we're going to be separated from God. We're going to be dragged into the place of the demons. And it is a terrifying moment. And Jesus is not there. Instead, we read where Jesus is in a few verses. This is verse 25, and it says, in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. Now, there are a few things we need to get clear about that sentence. Okay, the first one is that phrase, in the fourth watch of the night. So think about this. Do some math here. So we're talking about this storm appeared right at nightfall, but Jesus waited until the fourth watch of the night, meaning Jesus watched from the hilltop for hours watching his disciples face this storm. And he waits until the last moment, the moment where their will and their strength is just about gone. Their hope is just vanished. They think this is the end, folks. And that's when Jesus shows up. And we're talking about like this is a bottom of the ninth, like 2 minutes on the clock, last few seconds in the ring kind of moment. And that's when Jesus decides now's a good time to come in and rescue them. Now's a good time to come and save the day. And sometimes this is how God works. Like we want God to work immediately, and sometimes God waits until the last moment, the moment where we know, I can't do anymore. I've done all I can. This is in God's hands. And that's when God's like, okay, I've got this. And that's what happens. And he comes walking on the water. Now, let me clarify here. The way the Greek language is describing this, it's not like Jesus is struggling on the waves or that Jesus is doing a mad dash to the boat. The language here is more that Jesus is just taking a nice evening stroll. Like, in fact, if you read Mark's account of this story, Mark tells it as if Jesus has his hands in his pockets and he's just kind of whistling as he's like kicking a can across the water. And like he's so oblivious to this terrifying situation that Jesus is the one startled when he comes upon the disciples in the middle of the storm. Like, oh, hey, I didn't know you guys were here. Like that's how all the gospel writers describe Jesus in this moment, that this terrifying experience that was just about to kill the disciples, this horrible, horrible moment, was nothing to Jesus. That Jesus was that powerful, that he's just taken a nice evening stroll in the worst moment of the disciples' lives. It's not that he doesn't care, it's that he's just that much more powerful. And he comes in this moment, and the disciples think they see a ghost. If you read the story, they kind of cry out in fright. They're like, oh my gosh. They think it's like the abyss is opened up, and like some ghost is like, hey guys, let's go into the paradise. They think it's like that kind of moment. And so Jesus kind of speaks up to encourage them. And he says in verse 27, he says, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Okay, let's admit here, if you're in a terrifying situation and you see Jesus come walking on the water, that's probably a pretty encouraging thing. You're like, yeah, that's the guy who fed 5,000. That's the guy who has healed all these people. We've seen him defeat demons. Like, yes, there's probably a lot of encouragement seeing Jesus come, but I don't want us to miss what Jesus said. By him saying that phrase, it is I, that phrase also translates as I am is before you. You know, I am, the name of God in the Old Testament, Yahweh, the I am who I am. You know, if you've ever seen that movie, Prince of Egypt, or if you've ever read the Bible, Moses' story, you know this is the name of God. And Jesus in this moment has stepped into this scene. He's in this terrifying moment for the disciples, and he has stepped on the scene. And for the very first time in Matthew's gospel, he's saying, Yahweh, the creator of the universe, is right here before you. And you could be brave, and you could be courageous, and you can be encouraged in this terrifying, death-defying moment. As your world feels like it's on the verge of ending, the great I Am is before you. And I think if the disciples had enough time to think about this, they would have recalled a passage in Psalm 77, where it says, when the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled, the clouds poured out water, the skies gave forth thunder, your arrows flashed on every side, the crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind, your lightnings lighted up the world, the earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. What that psalm just said and described is that creation's way of trembling before God are storms, which is mind-blowing because we're terrified of storms as we should be, right? Like if you're outside and there's a tornado coming your way or a hurricane or some sort of disaster, like you have good reason to be afraid. And what that text is just saying in the Old Testament mindset is that when our earth produces storms, it's actually creation trembling before the might of our God. And it's describing that our God walks upon the storms. And so here Jesus is making this dramatic statement as this terrifying storm is happening. He arrives on the scene and he's telling them, hey, before you is the great I Am, is Yahweh. And so he's making a statement that just as Yahweh treads on the storms, now here's Jesus treading on the storm. Which is a mind-blowing thing because if you understand the Old Testament, Jesus is making some big claims because the Old Testament ends with basically all the prophets moaning and complaining because they know God has left them. They know God is no longer on the scene. They know because of their constant sin and failures, God has removed himself from Israel, but there's this promise that one day a Messiah is going to come who's going to reestablish God's kingdom and God's sense of justice of peace upon the earth. And when that kingdom is formed, then God would return. In the first 13 chapters of Matthew, Jesus is going around trying to establish that kingdom. He's making a claim that he is this long-awaited Messiah who is going to bring in God's kingdom. But the mindset of people was thinking that the Messiah and God were two different things. And here Jesus is saying not only is he the one who's going to bring in God's kingdom and bring in God's justice and bring in God's peace into a world that has forsaken God, but he was also God. That God has returned on the scene. That in the midst of their most terrifying moment, God was present and he has arrived to rescue them. And you got to be thinking, how do the disciples respond to this as everything is being torn apart around them? How do they respond? Well, we can always count on Peter to do something. And you read the Gospels, Peter always speaks up to stick his foot in his mouth, but I'm actually rather admiring of Peter in this story because he immediately stands up and says, if you are this Lord of creation, invite me to participate in it, which is what we should all be like. Because our purpose, remember, as image bearers is to reflect God's nature into the world and also reflect creation's worship back to God. We're like this angled mirror. That's our purpose in life, is that we're image bearers, that we should be participating with God. When he moves, when we see him active, it should be on our hearts of, I want to be part of whatever God's doing, especially if we're Christians. Because being a Christian means that you're going back to your original purpose of what you were meant to be. And so here Peter is standing up and says, if you are this God, let me participate. Let me fulfill my purpose in life and participating with you and what it seems like you're doing. And here's the amazing thing. Jesus calls him out of the boat. And the boat was everything. The boat was the only thing keeping them alive. The boat was the key to survival. And God and Jesus has called Peter to step away, to risk death, to risk humiliation, to risk failure, to thrive in the storm. And you know the story. Peter gets out. He starts walking. He's doing all right. His legs are probably shaking, but the story goes on and he doesn't make it all the way. It tells us in verse 30 It says, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. See, Peter has failed. See, like all the disciples in this story and all throughout the Gospels, they fail. They fail a lot. And he has done his best to be who he was meant to be. And like all of us, he still failed. Because the storm did to him what it does for all of us. It pushed him to doubt. It pushed him to give up on God. It pushed him to think, I've got to do this on my own. And it ultimately pushed him to fail. But remember who was standing right there. The one who called Peter out of the boat, who called Peter, hey, I want you to take a risk. I want you to move into this new way. Remember who was standing right there? It was Jesus. And the text tells us in verse 31, it says, Jesus immediately reached out his hand, took hold of him, saying to him, oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt? This is amazing. Because Jesus has called Peter out of the boat. He has called him to thrive. And Peter's failed. But guess what? Peter's victory was not dependent upon himself. Nor was Jesus' power dependent upon the faith of Peter. But guess what? His victory sure was dependent upon Jesus. And the faith that he has in Jesus. Which is an encouragement to all of us. That we can try to fight for victory. We can try to fight for success. But our victory and success is not dependent upon us. It's dependent upon Christ. And the story concludes in a very powerful way in Matthew chapter 14, verse 32. And it says, and when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. It stopped immediately. And those in the boat worshiped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. See, Peter failed, but Jesus did not. See, that's really what this is kind of showing us, is that, you know what, we might be some people who make mistakes, we might be people who fail, but Jesus does not. And this story is not really about the failure of Peter, it's really more of how God reveals himself in spite of Peter's failure. Because this is the first time in the story of Matthew and the story of Jesus where the disciples fall on their face and they cannot help but worship Jesus as the master of all things. As the Son of God, the creator of the universe. This is the first moment where they get to that point. And they get to this point not because of their successes, not because of their blessings in life, not because of some clever arguments, or even the miracles that they have seen Jesus do for probably a year at this point. They get to the point of worshiping him as God and as the hope of the world when they see God be present in their failures and rescue them in spite of their failures and their mistakes. It was in the moment when they thought it is over and they saw, you know what, God is here in this moment. God hasn't abandoned us. He has shown up on the scene to rescue us. That was the moment where it clicked with them. That who was before them was Jesus. And it was through the pathway of their failures. Which is the important observation I want us to walk away remembering this morning. That failure can sometimes mean that we learn something new about God. It could teach us something new about God. Which is kind of a little bit different than what we expect because we tend to think that failure is, well, a bad thing. But it might just be one of the best things that could ever happen to us. Because all success is on the road of failure, and it's in the failure of the disciples that they understood who God was, and it's in our failures where we can too learn who God is and who we are and how much we need him. That's the beautiful thing about failure. Now, surely this is an odd conversation to be having this morning. I mean, we're starting a brand new series talking about how we can thrive in the storms, right? Like we've talked about how we prepare for the storms of life. And we've talked about how we act in the midst of it. And now we're going to start talking about how we thrive in it. So it seems a little weird that when we talk about how we thrive in the storms of life, that we would begin by talking about our failures. Does that strike anyone as odd? Well, here's the thing. All successes come through the road of failure. Which means that sometimes failure is a good thing. Because it humbles us. It teaches us to rely upon God. It shows us more of who he is. It shows us that we're not the center of the universe, but Jesus is, because he matters more than us. And he says that he is here and that he's here to rescue us. I once had a college professor who was this retired Army colonel who taught a leadership management class that I was in. And he told us toward the end of our class that he wished upon us, as we were going forward in the ministry, that he wished upon us that we would have more failures than successes, which struck me as odd. So I'm like, who does that? Who wishes that upon someone? But I think it's because he understood that success can be a dangerous thing sometimes. But it's our failures that teach us who God is and how good he is and how gracious and how he doesn't give up on us even in spite of our constant mistakes and failures. And that sometimes it's through failure that leads us to becoming more of who we were meant to be. You know who knows this well? Is the movie industry. Think about every good movie. You think about Marvel. Let me bring up an example. Star Wars, all right? So Star Wars in New Hope, you have Luke Skywalker as this little kid, okay, pretty much this teenager. He makes a lot of mistakes, right? He makes a lot of failures, and some consequences happen, like Obi-Wan dies because of his failures. But it was through his failures that helped him become the person he needed to be to save the galaxy from the evil emperor. And I'm not trying to say, like, hey, when you fail, you're going to one day be this great person who's going to defeat the evil emperor and just save the galaxy, okay? That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying maybe your failures, those moments in life that make you feel alone and isolated and defeated and unloved, maybe those are the moments that God is using to teach you that he is present, that he wants to rescue you, and he's going to use that to help you become who you were always meant to be. So that when we look at our lives, and we have plenty of failures, right? Maybe the failure is a romantic relationship that didn't work out. Maybe it's a friendship that has just crumbled. Maybe it was a family situation. Now there's this awkward family tension at every reunion. Maybe the failure was something that was done to you, and now you feel like you're carrying the weight of the burden and the consequences. Maybe the failure was a business decision, a career decision, a thing that happened on a team or in class. Maybe the failure isn't even something that was done. Maybe the failure is just always thinking of yourselves as a failure. Always thinking of yourself as, I'm not good enough. I'm not saying these examples to bring up pain. I'm saying this, hey, I'm talking actually about myself. Because every one of those failures I've experienced. And I'm betting you have as well. And I'm betting that's true because you're a human being. And we mess up things a lot. We might even have the best of intentions sometimes, and things just fall apart. Like we can sweat, we can bleed, we can put all of our effort into something, and it still falls apart. And I get how defeated that can make anyone feel. I get how alone that can make anyone feel. But what's encouraging is when we look up God's word and we look at Jesus, we see that our failures do not stop him. The ways we mess up are nothing compared to his strength, that he is still with us. He still wants to rescue us. So those things that keep you up at night, I want you to be encouraged by that. I want you to be encouraged to look at your failures and rather than let them defeat you, look at them with a new perspective of what can I learn about God in this moment? Because it could bring about a better life. It could bring about you becoming who you're always meant to be. Because we see Jesus as the one who calms our anxious fears. We see Jesus as the one when we feel unloved who says, I love you and I'm here. Jesus is the one who speaks louder than our failures. And great love can come out of our great failures. When we see that in spite of our failures, God is still there. He is still investing in us. He's still fighting for us. And he's always ready to pull us up when we feel like we've hit rock bottom. Because that's who our Jesus is. Why don't you pray with me? Father, we need you. Like Peter, it is so easy for us to feel like we're drowning in the storms that we're facing in life. We have put all of our effort, all of our love, all of our wisdom, all of our strength and hope into these areas of our lives, and yet they still can sometimes fail. Or maybe it's just walking around with a thought thinking we're not good enough and that we're failures. Father, I cannot stress how much we need you. We need your help. Thank you for always being there. That sometimes in the darkest moments, that's the moment when you decide to show up on the scene. So we're asking to see you. We're asking to watch you rescue us yet again. To bring about a deeper love within us for you. Thank you for always being there. It's in your name I pray. Amen.